Thank you for the introduction and welcome to those who are here today live and for those who might be viewing this presentation in the future on the ACMI Education YouTube channel. As you heard, my name is Alex and I work at the University of Melbourne, and I obviously have an interest in video games and their potential role in schooling and informal education. I became interested in this field when I was a secondary school teacher myself. I was an English teacher and I was interested in the out of school literacy practices of the boys that I taught. And it was because of this interest and rather what I thought was a gap between the kinds of texts with privilege in classrooms and in schools and the kind of texts they were engaging with outside of schools. Because of this interest, I pursued a PhD looking at how the English classroom might be repositioned as a game-centered English classroom or games as literature classroom. And from this PhD, I ended up transitioning into teacher education at the University of Melbourne, and my research is now focused on video games and learning in school contexts. I apologise in advance if I'm a little stuffy. I'm getting over a cold. So this is the first of 3 sessions that are looking at this broader topic of going beyond engagement. We know video games are engaging. We know many young people should be careful of suggesting they'll all love playing and studying games at school, but we know many of them will. And what I hope to explore across this series is a number of ways that we might think differently about their potential use. So this first session, we'll look at the idea of moving beyond engagement and towards conceptual learning. What does it look like to do more than just play games? How might we as teachers need to build bridges towards, or between rather, video games and conceptual learning? The second session will look more specifically at reading and reading practices associated with video games. And it's here where there'll be a bit of a play with reading, viewing, and playing. How might different approaches to the playing and reading of games produce different learning outcomes in our classrooms? And in the third session, we'll look at a bit more of the nuts and bolts. What does it mean to plan and design your own video game-centered curriculum? What might be some of the opportunities and challenges? How do we configure a classroom? What are the challenges associated with the technology, with game licenses? Those kind of challenges. I wanted to start by referring to Sarah Grimes's pendulum dynamic. And Grimes uses the pendulum as a kind of metaphor to compare a number of approaches to how we think about games in contemporary society. And I think this is relevant for those teachers who are considering bringing this technology into their classrooms. Grimes says that on the one hand, this pendulum often swings towards the idea of games as beneficial. And it's here that there's an emphasis on interactivity, on the possible learning efficiencies because of the way that games are coded, the benefits of socializing in online or virtual spaces, playing with others, the kinds of 21st century skills that games might encourage, problem solving, coding, and how often this games as beneficial discourse, kind of aligns with ideas around educational technology. On the other hand, Grimes also says that the pendulum can swing towards the games as detrimental discourse. And it's over here that we get that kind of moral panic around games, that they're associated with the idea that young people are in crisis, that they're somehow always at risk, and games are contributing to this. And we know the ideas that we often see in the media around game addiction or screen time, even possibly aggression associated with games. So what is useful about Grimes's pendulum is that it starts to move us from games as some kind of neutral object in the world or cultural medium, towards their use. What happens once we play games? What happens when we realize play with people in real contexts? Because that's a kind of shift that we'll need to take in our thinking if we're going to situate them within school contexts, which have all of their own kind of social and cultural factors that impact what happens there. And I think it's important to make the shift towards thinking about games in social and cultural contexts, because a lot has been taken for granted around their potential. A lot has been claimed without sufficient evidence. And these claims can be thought of in terms of problems and solutions. And on the one hand, authors like those that you see here have a tendency to articulate or to make assertions about educational problems. These problems make claims about the types of effective learning methods out there, around distinctions between old ways of learning and new ways of learning, or old technologies and new technologies. They talk about education systems as broken, or modern teaching as broken. And of course, games are proposed as the solution. And in this switch towards solutions, we see some of this rhetoric around digital game-based learning. It meets the needs, learning styles of today's and future generations. It's motivating, it's fun, it's versatile. And it's easy to see the attraction of this messaging. And, we can all recognize that lots of aspects of contemporary education that are imperfect, that are flawed. But we've got to be cautious of jumping, too enthusiastically into the digital game-based learning discourse, because what we can do is take for granted that all we need is the game, that the game in and of itself will produce kinds of play that will contribute to learning. And I guess I'm trying to kind of problematize that idea with you today, and to do so through the idea of conceptual learning, some of the more challenging aspects of what it is we want to do in our classrooms. And one way to start to think about how we might shift from games as media or objects towards games in practice is to think about some of the approaches that have been taken to implement and to utilize digital games in learning. There's the instructivist approach, the idea that the emphasis is placed on the role of the game to do the teaching. They are the instructor. A teacher in the classroom will take a real backseat, that they'll let the game do the instructing. And this really leans heavily on the way a game is being coded. You might think here about language learning games like Duolingo, where the learner is positioned in a relatively passive role, and they follow the direction of the game. Another way to think about an approach to using games is through a constructivist lens. And for many, the constructivist approach is a response to the instructivist. It's like an improvement of the instructivist approach. And here, the kinds of messages are around individuals learning best when they're actively building their own understandings. And so in the context of a game-based learning environment, it's about immersion in a micro world or a virtual world, a digital world. And the design of that world supports interaction with complex ideas. So Minecraft would be a good example. Through engaging in the Minecraft world, through constructing and engaging with elements, certain kinds of knowledge will develop. So it's the learning by doing of philosophy. There's also increasingly an interest in a more critical approach. And it's here where we might, instead of learning through games, the emphasis switches a little bit to learning about games. So rather than games as some kind of neutral object, games are positioned as something that's constructed, something that was designed intentionally and reflects the objectives of their designers. And often these objectives, or mostly these objectives, are economic objectives, to profit, to make money. So you can see how the kinds of classroom activities from a critical approach might be different to the types of classroom activities associated with one of the other approaches. And the other thing that's interesting about a more critical approach is that the study is not just of the design of games, but also game cultures, how these cultures might be problematic. So through highlighting these three approaches, and they're certainly not the only approaches, you can start to see how as a classroom teacher, they encourage you to think about the kinds of ways you would center video games for study. These different approaches might also inform the kinds of games that you would select, the kinds of teaching practices. So what I want to do is show you some gameplay. It's a short snippet, and it's from a wonderful Australian game called Paperbark, which is made by the award-winning studio Paperhouse Games. And it's about 2.5 to 3 minutes, and it starts off a little bit quiet, so don't turn your volume up straight away. And I want to try and use this short moment of gameplay to ask some questions about how we, as teachers, might need to do some of that intentional work if we want to get students towards some subject-specific conceptual knowledge. All right, let's watch this short sequence.
The paperbark tree. Fallen logs are no match for this hungry wombat. The wombat does not notice the little fairy wrens, but the fairy wrens definitely notice the wombat.
Now, it's a lovely game. If you haven't played it, I would encourage you to get it and to have a go. Yeah, and in watching this gameplay or engaging with the game, we might start to ask, well, what's the learning that I might take away from this short 2.5 minutes? And we might deduce that there's some learning around wombats. What do they look like? How do they move across the landscape? How do they engage with their environment? And there might also be some learning around Australian flora and fauna and what characterises flora and fauna. We might also start to build a picture of this idea of the bush. What does the bush look like? What are the different elements in this concept of the bush? And these learnings are fine, right? They're nice, they're lovely takeaways as a result of some fun engagement. But schooling asks a little more of us, and in particular, the challenging parts of schooling, but the conceptual knowledge require a lot more from our students. And so if we are to approach this question of conceptual knowledge from a subject perspective, it poses some questions on us. So if we were to think about the subject we call English or literature, and what are the concepts in this subject that we might explore through such a game, we might start to look at things like narrative or protagonists, notions of authorial intent, music, sound effects, and the narrator. And so you can see how there are elements of these that are present in that 2.5 minutes of gameplay. They might require a little bit more work to bring to the fore and to make connections between the gameplay and some of those concepts. Similarly, the subject we call art or visual design has some core concepts: line, shape, color, texture, an idea of white space or size. And again, we can see how these are evident in the gameplay, but they might not necessarily be immediately, or the player might not be immediately aware of their presence or to understand what those concepts are doing there, how the designers might be using those concepts. Similarly, we might approach that gameplay from the perspective of environmental studies. Important concepts like biodiversity and ecosystem conservation. These are crucial to how we want people to think in the domain called environmental studies. And those moments of gameplay we saw offer openings, if you like, to some of these concepts. But again, if we're thinking about this game as being mostly for a younger audience, perhaps somewhere in the primary or elementary years, these concepts aren't necessarily overt in that gameplay. And hence the bridging part of this message that I have, requires us to consider, what am I going to do to build bridges to these concepts, to the conceptual knowledge that I want students to take away from an activity, a lesson, a term, a year of study. And you might say that there's at least two parts to building these bridges. One part is the language component. As a result of playing this game, or as a result of engaging through the everyday parts of our world, we have everyday language. The language we use to make sense of the world around us. If we're sitting next to someone playing the game, we might be talking about our gameplay, how to get to the next level, what's happening on the screen. And likewise, we might have spontaneous concepts, kind of like ideas that come to us that capture something about that moment or what's happening on the screen. But we're interested in something, schooling is interested in something a little bit more specific and a little bit more abstract. And because of the organisation of schooling into subject areas or domains, we need students to demonstrate mastery of specialist academic languages. And we saw, if I just go back, examples here of some of that specialist academic language. We need a student to use the language of English when they're in the English classroom. We need them to use the language of art in the art classroom to make sense of the particular text. So there's a role here for instruction to play in moving students from the everyday language that they might use to play this game at home towards more specialist academic language. And of course, this will require us to consider what that specialist academic language is, to have a really clear sense of the vocabulary necessary to explore a particular concept like biodiversity, for example. Similarly, whilst there are spontaneous concepts that students might talk about or raise when they're playing this game at home or car or on holidays, we're interested in subject-specific concepts. We might call these more scientific concepts, although they're certainly not specific to the hard sciences. And these are inevitably difficult for young people, for all learners, to get a grasp of, because they're more abstract, they're less complex. So again, that metaphor of bridging is important here. How will I move students from the everyday language that might typify their play outside of the classroom towards more specialist academic language? And how might I move them from some more spontaneous concepts towards more subject-specific or scientific concepts? And it's here where you can see there's a real opening for emphasising pedagogy, the role of pedagogy. We've talked already about the technology and the risk of taking an overly deterministic approach to technology. The idea that the technology in and of itself will achieve my learning goals. And I've worked with schools who have asked me to come in and to help them design curricula. And then a whole range of teachers have implemented, a curriculum unit. And some of the teachers put a lot of faith in the technology. So there'll be lots of play, lots of time spent playing the game. But then a bit of a faith that the game can carry all of the pedagogic load, all the instructional load. And one of the consequences of that is that some students can get left behind. students that need a little bit more scaffolding towards the curriculum goals, the more difficult conceptual goals, can struggle. So this is where I think there's room to think about this dynamic interplay between what are my curriculum goals, in particular my difficult conceptual goals, what technologies will I use to support these goals, and how am I going to design learning, teaching and learning that facilitates students being able to master the academic language and the academic concepts. And it's here where I think the Australian professor Bill Green's work is really important. Green's interested in schools as cultural sites and what it means for us to support students to master those cultural sites, and sites in the plural sense. And Green says, learning languages through reading and writing activities involves learning culture and being socialized into the culture. To learn culture and to become an effective, functioning participant in the culture involves learning the language and becoming competent with regards to using it as a resource for meaning. And Green's use of culture here is kind of like a subject. We need to socialize students into the subjects of school. We need to help them do that. And the technology might have a part to play, but our role is to use the technology to help enculturate students, to socialize them into mastering what's required of them in particular cultural domains. And a part of that is understanding how different concepts work, how they help us think through the knowledge of different subject areas. And so this immediately makes me think about the role of the teacher. What's the teacher going to do to build these bridges? Clearly, play has a part. And there are teachers who will bring a game into their classroom to support school learning. And there might be a couple of minutes of discussion. Students will play a game for the next 85 minutes and then a couple of minutes discussion at the end. So clearly, in this context, there's a lot of work being done by playing as a literacy practice. But I think we want to keep in mind all of the other kinds of practices that might support this difficult work of conceptual learning. Speaking and listening practice is going to be important, not just students speaking and listening to each other as they play, but speaking and listening with the teacher who can offer questions at the right times, speaking and listening after moments of gameplay. Likewise, writing practices are going to be important. What kinds of pre-game writing, maybe a brainstorm, might facilitate learning? What kind of writing as note-taking, writing for learning, might take place while someone is playing, and then writing after a moment of gameplay? And what kind of reading practices might we introduce before, during, and after gameplay that can facilitate this bridge from the technology towards some kind of curriculum goal? So what might this look like? Well, let's take one of our earlier concepts that we introduced in the subject we call English, that the concept of authorial intent is really important. We want students to try and understand what authors or creators or film directors were trying to do. So we might begin by brainstorming a list of texts, text types that students are aware of, and then matching those texts up with the names of the designers or the creators. Start to build a bridge between text as something that exists and is created by someone or a team. And then we can do a bit of pair and share in the classroom, maybe start to add to that particular goals in mind, those creators. We could then move towards identifying some of the techniques that are used. So we could pick one of those texts and start to look at, well, what are the techniques that this filmmaker has used to create this film? From there, we could move towards the gameplay. Give students a chance to play paperbark. And from there could be an effort to identify some of the design elements. What kind of design tools have the designers of this game used to enable play, to make play happen, to bring things into being on the screen? Then each one of these design elements could be the central focus of discussion to help us or bring us towards authorial intent as a sustained focus where the game serves a purpose, but it's supported by other practices. Alternatively, if we look at the concept of biodiversity, which is important for the study of environmental studies, we might begin in a more traditional sense with textbook definition, reading the definition, rewriting it in plain language, picking it apart. And then from there, we could create a brainstorm, vocabulary list. What are all the kinds of words that we might need to use to explore this concept of biodiversity? From here, we can give students a chance to play the game, to take control of the wombat and move through the landscape that's offered to us by the game designers. We might then have some comprehension questions that might start in a more literal way. What happens in this game? What do you see? What are you observing? What do you hear? Towards the more inferential. What might this mean? What kind of relationships are being set up between different elements in the game? We might then invite students to go outside of the classroom, to go to different parts of the schoolyard and collect other examples of the diverse natural landscape. How is the life forms near the basketball courts different to the life forms underneath the trees? And then bringing the students back together, we could start to do some comparing, and contrasting the kinds of biodiversity identified and focused in the game versus the kind of biodiversity in different parts of the schoolyard. And so in emphasising learning that goes beyond how the game has been coded, I really like the work of Tim Thorne, who was kind of setting up this notion of an entangled pedagogy. And Thorne is trying to move us away from those deterministic approaches to technology, and in particular educational technology. He wants us to challenge some of the claims made about educational technology. And he says there's always a mutual shaping of purpose, context, values, methods, and technology. They're always kind of in this messy entanglement together. And I really like that, because if you start to unpack each of those elements, it poses a really nice set of questions, if you like, or areas of focus for those interested in designing their own game-centered curriculum, whether it's a single activity in a lesson or a more sustained use of a digital game. Beginning with purpose. What is my purpose in this unit? Maybe it's just engagement. Maybe all I want is to switch my students on for learning. And if that's the case, well, then I'm probably not going to give them a summative assessment task about those activities, right? Because I'm not going to scaffold any learning. I'm just going to let them play. Maybe there's a moment for that. But perhaps I have some more intentional goals, some more curriculum goals. And if so, that might get me to think a little bit differently about what we do with those games. Likewise, all of us live, work, in contexts, and schools are their own contexts. So what is it about my context that I need to consider when I'm bringing in a digital game? Who are my students? What game experiences do they bring to that particular context? And there's often a lot of assumptions about young people as gamers, when in fact lots of young people don't play games at all and have never played video games. And so there's going to be some consequences if we bring games into our classrooms and presume the more mechanical operational skills necessary to bring that game into being. Those skills are held by all the students. And what about values? How might the school's values and individual teachers' values work to support or produce obstacles for the kinds of learning that we want? I've worked with some teachers that were really keen to design a game-centered curriculum, and I worked with them to design that curriculum. But then when it was implemented by a whole year level of teachers, there were those teachers whose values didn't include gameplay. For them, play was something that happened outside of school. And so those values were brought into the classroom, because in some of those classrooms, students weren't allowed to play. So it's really important that we reflect on the kinds of values of the different stakeholders in our sites. Methods, in the sense that it's identified here, could be teaching methods. How will I allow students to play these games? What might be the configuration in the room? And that's something we'll consider in the third session in this series. And finally, there's a lot of questions around the technology itself. Will I get a console? Will students install these games on their devices? Do I need internet connectivity? So even though Fawn presents this as an entangled pedagogy, and I agree with him that these are always mutually shaping each other, I think it's a nice reminder of the value of keeping in mind that, yes, we have the digital game, that's in the bottom there, technology, but we have all of these other components or elements that are going to be involved in shaping what we might do. So in this first session, we've looked at the idea of going beyond games as objects, as something that is purely for engagement, and starting to think in terms of how they might support us to do some of the more complex tasks of teaching, which is supporting conceptual learning, some of the abstract knowledge that's difficult for students to learn. In the next session, I'll talk a little bit more about reading, and in particular readings in the plural sense. What kinds of instructional strategies, approaches to reading might produce different opportunities for meaning making through play. And in the third and final session, we'll look at some of the more nuts and bolts, the idea of that planning and designing a game-centered curriculum is going to involve considering a whole range of factors, and they're all important factors.